Renee Calloway found out about her mother's 50th wedding anniversary party the same way she found out about most things in her family now, by accident through someone else's phone. She was sitting in the break room at St. Augustine Regional, halfway through a cold cup of coffee before her shift on the surgical floor, when her cousin Denise texted the family group chat a photo of a cream-colored invitation with gold foil script. 50 years of love. Harold and Patricia Calloway. Denise's caption read, "Can't wait for this, Aunt Pat deserves the world," followed by 3 heart emojis. Renee stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting for the follow-up. The one that would say, "And don't forget, RSVP by the 30th," or "Renee, did you get yours yet?" It never came. She scrolled up through 11 months of the group chat. Birthdays, a graduation, a baby shower for her brother Marcus's second child, and found her own name mentioned exactly twice, both times in relation to a task. "Renee, can you swing by and grab Mom's blood pressure meds? Renee, we need someone with a truck for the folding tables." She was 34 years old, a trauma nurse with 12 years of experience, and she had just learned about her own parents' 50th anniversary party from a cousin's group text. She set the coffee down because her hand had started to shake, and not from caffeine. The thing about being the family's utility player is that nobody tells you when you've been demoted from the guest list. You just notice one absence at a time until one day you do the math and realize the pattern isn't random. It has a shape. And once Renee saw the shape, she couldn't unsee it. She was the middle child, sandwiched between her older sister Bianca and her younger brother Marcus. And for most of her childhood that hadn't meant anything in particular. But everything changed the year Renee turned 16, the year her father, Charles, walked out on Patricia for a woman he'd met at a conference in Charlotte. He didn't just leave. He left loud, with a public affair, a messy divorce, and a habit of showing up unannounced at Renee's school events for the 2 years after, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't detonated the family and driven off in his convertible while Patricia sat at the kitchen table doing the math on how she'd keep the house. And Renee looked like him. Not resembled, looked like him, unmistakably, the same wide-set brown eyes, the same crooked smile that showed more on the left side, the same long-fingered hands he used to play piano badly on Sunday afternoons. Bianca took after their mother's side, small and round-faced. Marcus was a blend nobody could quite place. But Renee was Charles Calloway's daughter down to the bone, and Patricia had spent 18 years learning to look at her middle child and see her ex-husband's face smiling back. Nobody ever said it directly. That would have required Patricia to admit something about herself she wasn't ready to admit. Instead it came out sideways. In the way Patricia's eyes would go distant during Renee's college graduation photos, in the way she introduced Renee to new people as, "my daughter, the nurse," while she introduced Bianca as, "my daughter, my best friend." It came out in seating charts at Thanksgiving where Renee somehow always ended up at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, useful for refilling drinks. Came out most of all in what Renee had started calling, only in her own head because saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat, her utility function. Need the gutters cleaned before a storm? Call Renee, she's got the ladder and the day off. Need someone to sit in the ER waiting room for 6 hours during Uncle Theo's cardiac scare? Renee's a nurse, she'll know what the doctors are actually saying. Need a $400 loan 2 weeks before payday because Marcus's paycheck got held up? Renee always has a little saved. Need someone to drive 90 minutes each way every Sunday, to bring Patricia her prescriptions and sit with her through her knee replacement recovery? Renee doesn't have kids yet. Renee has the time. Renee always had the time because somewhere along the way she had learned that having the time, being available, being useful, being needed, was the only currency that got her a seat anywhere near the family table. Not loved for herself currency. Needed for her function currency. It wasn't the same thing, but for 15 years she had told herself it was close enough. She had, if she was honest with herself in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital break room that afternoon, been auditioning for a role in her own family since she was 19 years old. And she had just found out, via a cousin's group text with heart emojis, that she'd been cut from the cast. Renee didn't confront her mother right away. That wasn't how things worked between them. Direct confrontation had a way of dissolving into Patricia's tears and Renee's apologies for things she hadn't even done. A script so old and well-worn that Renee could recite both parts. Instead she did what she always did when something cracked open inside her. She kept moving. She picked up an extra shift. She drove the 90 minutes the following Sunday as scheduled, to drop off Patricia's refilled prescriptions and change the water filter under the sink. Because Patricia had mentioned it was due and Renee, God help her, had written it in her own planner like a woman on a payroll she'd never agreed to. Patricia answered the door in her robe, hair still in rollers, and there was a strange, guilty flicker in her eyes when she saw Renee's face. A half-second if she knows, before it smoothed over into the pleasant, distracted warmth Patricia reserved for people she loved at a manageable distance. "You didn't have to come all this way for a water filter, honey," Patricia said, which was what she always said, and which had never once stopped her from mentioning the filter needed changing. "I don't mind," Renee said, which was what she always said, and which had stopped being fully true about 4 years ago. She fixed the filter. She organized the pill organizer for the week, color-coded, the way she taught herself to do for patients 20 years older than her own mother. She noticed on the refrigerator held up by a magnet shaped like a seashell from a trip to Hilton Head that Renee had not been invited on, a printed copy of the same invitation Denise had texted. 50 years of love. Up close in cream and gold, it looked less like a party and more like a verdict. "That's a nice invitation," Renee said, testing the water the way you'd test a stove burner you suspected was already hot. Patricia's hands went still over the stack of mail she was sorting. "Oh yes. Bianca had them printed. She's been such a help planning everything. A beat. It's going to be a big one. 200 people if you can believe it. Your father's side is coming too if you can imagine. Your father's side is coming too." Renee turned that sentence over twice before she understood it. Charles, the man who had left, who had built a new life with his conference affair wife in Charlotte, whose absence had apparently poisoned Renee's face in her own mother's eyes for 15 years, was invited. His new wife was invited. His side of the family, cousins Renee hadn't spoken to since she was 17, was invited. And Renee, the daughter who drove 90 minutes every Sunday, who had covered 3 of Patricia's medical co-pays without ever mentioning it, who had sat in a hospital hallway for 6 hours holding her mother's hand after the knee surgery while Bianca couldn't get off work. And Marcus wasn't good in hospitals. Renee was not on the list. "Am I not invited, Mom?" She hadn't planned to ask it so plainly. It came out of her flat and quiet the way she delivered bad news to families in the ER because some part of her, the trauma nurse part, the part that had learned to say "I need to tell you something difficult" without flinching, had taken over where the daughter part had gone numb. Patricia's face did something complicated. Guilt, then irritation at being caught in the guilt, then a kind of practiced wounded innocence that Renee recognized from 1,000 childhood arguments. "Renee, it's complicated. It's a big party. We had to think about the room and the dynamics. You know how you and your father. I haven't spoken to Dad in 6 years. I know, honey, but you look so much like..." Patricia stopped herself. Too late. The sentence hung there in the kitchen, unfinished, and for the first time in 15 years, unmistakably finished anyway. "You look so much like him." Renee had known it. She had known it the way you know a scar is there even when you can't see it in the mirror, by the shape of everything built around it. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and hearing your mother say it out loud, even half a sentence of it in her own kitchen over a pill organizer Renee had just finished filling. "I'll get out of your hair," Renee said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I changed the filter. Meds are sorted through next Sunday." "Renee. I'll see you around, Mom." He did not slam the door. She had spent her whole life being the daughter who didn't cause scenes, and some habits, it turned out, didn't break even at the exact moment they should have. She sat in her car in the driveway for 11 minutes before she could make her hands work well enough to drive. When she finally pulled out, she didn't go home. She drove to the 24-hour diner off Route 9 where she used to go with her college roommate, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and finally, for the first time since the group text, let herself cry. Not the pretty, contained crying she did at funerals, but the ugly kind, shoulders shaking, that made the waitress bring her a second napkin dispenser without asking. Somewhere in the middle of it, between one sob and the next, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like an epiphany in a movie. It felt more like a tooth finally coming loose after years of being worked at, sore and strange and suddenly terribly clear. He thought about the 15 years. The gutters. The prescriptions. The 90-minute drives. The co-pays she'd never mentioned because mentioning them would have required Patricia to say thank you, and some instinct in Renee had always known that thank yous were rationed in this family, doled out to Bianca for existing and to Marcus for showing up, and earned by Renee only through labor, only through utility, only through being useful enough that her face, her father's face, could be tolerated in the room a little longer. She thought about the word Patricia hadn't finished. "You look so much like..." And she thought, "I am done auditioning for a part one was never going to get." It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was smaller than that and stranger. It was the recognition that she had spent 15 years paying rent on a room she'd already been evicted from, and nobody had bothered to tell her the locks had changed. The next 6 weeks were the quietest of Renee's adult life, and also in a way she didn't expect, the fullest. She stopped driving to her mother's on Sundays. She didn't announce it, she simply didn't go, and when Patricia texted the following Sunday, "Did you forget the pharmacy pickup, honey?" Renee typed and deleted 4 different responses before finally sending, "I'm not able to keep doing the Sunday trips. You'll need to arrange pickup another way." The silence that followed lasted 4 days. Then Bianca called, furious, informing Renee that Mom was devastated and confused, and that this was so unlike her, as though Renee had committed an act of violence rather than simply stopped after 15 years, doing a job no one had ever formally offered to pay her for, financially or otherwise. "She's 60 next month, Renee. Do you know how stressful party planning is? And now you're pulling this." "Pulling what, Bianca?" "Not driving 3 hours round trip every week. You know what I mean. This isn't the time to make everything about you." Renee almost laughed, a short, disbelieving huff of air. Make everything about her. He thought of the group chat, the invitation on the fridge, the unfinished sentence in the kitchen. In 34 years she could not remember a single instance of anything in this family being about her, and the one time she stepped back from being useful, it became suddenly, retroactively, the most self-centered act imaginable. "I'm not doing this with you right now," Renee said, and hung up and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in weeks. She used the newly freed Sundays for herself, actual herself, not the version of herself calibrated for her mother's comfort. She started running again, something she'd loved in nursing school and quietly let die under the weight of the family schedule. She picked up a woodcarving hobby she'd always been curious about, bought a cheap set of chisels off a hobby site, and spent one whole gorgeous, useless Sunday afternoon ruining a block of basswood and loving every minute of the mess. She reconnected with an old friend from nursing school, Priya, who had moved back to the area and who listened to the whole 15-year story over a bottle of wine without once telling Renee she was overreacting. "You know what strikes me," Priya said, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem, "is that you're the one everybody calls in a crisis. Not Bianca. Not Marcus. When your mom had the knee surgery, when your uncle had the cardiac scare, they call the daughter who looks like the man who broke this family because deep down they know she's the only one who'll actually show up. And then they don't invite her to the party." Renee hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms before, but once Priya said it, she couldn't unhear it. She was the family's emergency contact and its social outcast simultaneously, and the two facts had coexisted for so long that Renee had stopped noticing how insane that arrangement actually was. The reckoning, when it came, arrived the way most real reckonings do, not through a grand confrontation but through an accident nobody planned. 6 weeks before the anniversary party, Marcus's youngest, a 6-year-old named Cody, fell off a jungle gym at school and hit his head hard enough that the school nurse called an ambulance as a precaution. Marcus was at work an hour away and couldn't get there in time. His wife, Alyssa, was at a doctor's appointment of her own and had her phone off. In a panic, the school called the only emergency contact who'd been able to pick up her phone in under 30 seconds for the last decade, Renee. She left mid-shift, badge still on, and made it to the ER before the ambulance had even finished triage. She knew half the staff there from cross-coverage rotations, and within minutes she was standing at Cody's bedside in scrubs, translating the resident's rapid-fire assessment into plain, calm English for a terrified 6-year-old, holding his hand while they got imaging, staying through the whole 4-hour ordeal until Marcus and Alyssa arrived white-faced and shaking. "Thank God you were there," Alyssa kept saying over and over, gripping Renee's hand. "Thank God. I don't know what we would have done." Marcus hugged her for the first time in years. "You're a lifesaver, Ren. I mean that." It was, Renee thought later, driving home at 11 that night still in her scrubs, the single warmest moment she'd had with her family in longer than she could remember. And it made something in her go cold and clear because she understood finally exactly what she was to them. Not a sister. Not a daughter, not really, not in the way that mattered at anniversary parties and holiday seating charts. A lifesaver. An emergency contact. A resource deployed when useful, stored away when not, and never once given a permanent place at the table that her utility had, in some sense, been paying rent on for 15 years. That night she didn't cry. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind she used for discharge instructions at work, and she started writing. Not a letter. Not yet. A list. Every time I was called on. Every time I wasn't invited. It took her almost until 2 a.m. to fill 4 pages, and by the end of it, laid out in her own handwriting in blue ballpoint, the pattern that had lived in her body for 15 years as a vague, aching sense of something's wrong with me revealed itself as something else entirely. A ledger. A one-sided ledger kept faithfully by Renee alone, in which she had given and given and given, and the family had taken and taken and taken, and called it love because the alternative, admitting what it actually was, would have cost them something they weren't willing to pay. She did not want revenge exactly. What she wanted, she realized as she stared down at 4 pages of her own careful accounting, was the truth to exist somewhere outside her own head. She wanted it witnessed. The plan that formed over the following weeks wasn't dramatic and it wasn't cruel. Renee had built her whole adult identity on not being the person who caused scenes, and she wasn't about to torch that identity for the sake of a single blow-up that would only let her family recast her, yet again as the difficult one, the disruptive one, the one who ruined Mom's party. She'd watched that move her entire life. She wasn't going to hand them the script. Instead she did something quieter and in its own way far more devastating. She was, it turned out, still on the guest list for the smaller pre-party gathering. A Friday evening dinner 2 nights before the main event, just immediate family and a few close relatives, meant to be an intimate toast before the 200-person spectacle. Bianca had apparently decided, or perhaps simply forgotten, to uninvite her from this smaller event. Maybe because the family still needed someone to help set up chairs and run to the store for ice. Renee went. She helped set up chairs. She ran to the store for ice because old habits, it turned out, took more than 6 weeks to unlearn completely, and because she had a plan that required her to be there, calm and present, exactly as expected. And she brought a gift. She had spent 4 of her freed-up Sundays on it, working in the small back room she'd converted into a hobby space, using not the chisels this time but a needle and thread and a box of fabric scraps she'd been collecting, almost unconsciously, for months. Pieces of old clothing, a swatch from Renee's childhood baby blanket that Patricia had kept and, in a rare moment of sentimentality years ago, given back to her, a scrap of Charles's old flannel shirt that Renee had found absurdly still folded in a box in her own closet from when she was 17 and had stolen it the week he left because it still smelled like him and she hadn't yet learned to hate him for leaving. She made a quilt. It wasn't sentimental in the soft focus way a quilt gift is supposed to be. Each square told something true. A square of pale yellow from the dress Patricia wore in Renee's favorite childhood photograph, the 2 of them at the county fair before everything. A square of gray flannel from Charles's shirt, because he was part of the story whether anyone wanted him stitched in or not. A square from the hospital gown fabric Renee had specially ordered, plain cotton dyed pale blue, representing the knee surgery, the 6 hours in the hallway, the co-pays no one thanked her for. A square of scrub blue fabric for Cody's ER visit. And in the center, the largest square, a piece of cream fabric with gold thread stitched in a careful, deliberate line spelling out nothing sentimental at all, just a date. The date of the group text. The date Renee found out from a cousin that she wasn't invited to her parents' 50th anniversary. She wrapped it in plain brown paper, no bow, and brought it to the Friday dinner and set it on the gift table without a word and helped with the ice and smiled at her mother's friends, and was, by every outward measure, the same useful, pleasant, available Renee she had always been. Patricia opened it after dinner in front of the dozen or so relatives gathered in the living room, expecting. Renee could see it on her face. Something soft. Something forgivable. A nice throw blanket, maybe the kind of safe, generic gift a slightly distant daughter gives a mother she's trying to smooth things over with. Instead, Patricia unfolded a quilt that told, square by square, in a language only their family could fully read, the entire true story of the last 15 years. The abandonment, the resemblance, the labor, the exclusion, the date on the invitation. Stitched by hand patiently by the daughter she had spent a decade and a half quietly, unfinishedly, blaming for the shape of a face she hadn't chosen. The room went very quiet. "Renee," Patricia said, her voice thin, staring down at the squares, her fingers tracing the gray flannel that had once been Charles's shirt. "What is this?" "It's the truth," Renee said. Her voice didn't shake. She had rehearsed nothing, and yet the sentence came out whole, like it had been waiting 15 years to be said. "I thought it was time somebody put it together instead of just living inside it." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one, not that night. She said her goodbyes to the room like a woman leaving a routine shift, kissed her mother's cheek, Patricia sitting frozen, the quilt still spread across her lap, staring at the gray square like it might burn her, and drove home in the dark with the windows cracked. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't replay the evening in her head looking for the moment she'd failed. She just drove and breathed and let it be over. The main party 2 nights later happened without her. She hadn't been invited, and this time, deliberately, she didn't offer to help set up, didn't drop off ice, didn't drive the folding tables over even though she still had the truck and the day off. She spent that Saturday at Priya's place instead, the two of them refinishing an old dresser Priya had found on the curb, hands covered in stripping gel and paint chips, phone face down on the counter. She found out later from Marcus that the party had gone forward as planned, 200 guests, a band, Charles and his new wife making a brief, awkward appearance near the dessert table. Marcus told her Patricia had seemed distracted the whole night, had disappeared for nearly 40 minutes at one point and come back with her makeup redone, eyes rimmed red under the concealer. Nobody at the party knew why. Marcus didn't know why either. He hadn't been at the Friday dinner. But Bianca had, and Bianca, for the first time in Renee's memory, hadn't called to yell at her afterward. The apology, when it eventually came, didn't arrive as a scene either. It arrived 3 weeks later as a letter. An actual handwritten letter for pages in Patricia's looping cursive, mailed to Renee's apartment rather than texted, as though Patricia understood, finally, that this particular truth deserved something with more weight than a phone screen. Renee read it standing in her kitchen, still in her scrubs, coat not yet off. Patricia wrote about Charles, things Renee had never known or had known only in fragments. That in the immediate aftermath of the affair, in the rawest, most shattered months of her life, Patricia had looked at 19-year-old Renee's face across the dinner table and felt something break loose in her that she'd been too ashamed to name even to herself. Not hatred, she wrote, never hatred, but a grief so specific it curdled into something that looked like distance, because loving Renee fully had started to feel, in Patricia's most broken moments, like loving Charles all over again. And she hadn't had the strength for it, and instead of getting help she had simply, slowly, without ever deciding to, pulled away, and then spent 15 years too ashamed of the pulling away to name it, let alone fix it, watching her own daughter fill the silence with casseroles and pharmacy runs and ambulance rides, mistaking Renee's devotion for evidence that everything was fine because the alternative, sitting with what she'd actually done, was more than she'd been able to face. "I saw your father in your face," Patricia wrote, "and I punished you for it for 15 years and you kept showing up anyway, and I told myself that was normal, that was just how you were, generous, reliable, and it never once occurred to me until I saw that quilt, that generosity has a cost, and I had been letting you pay it alone, over and over while I sat at the head of a table I never once saved you a seat at. I don't expect you to forgive me on any particular timeline. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for a timeline at all. But I wanted you to know that I saw it, really saw it finally, and that whatever this becomes between us now, however slow, I'd like it to be honest. You gave this family 15 years of honesty it didn't deserve. I'd like to try, badly and imperfectly, to give some back." Renee read the letter twice, sitting at her kitchen table with her coat still on, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered. Not many things, but the important ones, and she sat there for a long while in the quiet of her apartment, not crying exactly, just breathing, feeling the strange, unfamiliar weight of being seen instead of simply being useful. She didn't rush back into the old shape of things. That was the part she was proudest of, looking back, that she let the apology be a beginning rather than a reset button, that she didn't immediately resume the 90-minute Sunday drives or the unspoken agreement to be everyone's emergency contact and nobody's guest of honor. Trust, she'd learned in 12 years of nursing, is rebuilt in small, verifiable increments, not restored by a single grand gesture, however sincere. A letter was a start. It wasn't a cure. Over the following months, something new and slower grew in its place. Patricia started calling, actually calling, not texting a task, just to talk, sometimes about nothing at all, and twice she asked Renee about her own life, her own hobbies, in a way that felt genuinely curious rather than dutiful. She mentioned once almost shyly that she'd started seeing a therapist, someone Bianca had found for her, and that the first few sessions had mostly consisted of Patricia crying about a quilt. Bianca, for her part, never fully apologized. Some family members Renee had come to understand could only meet you halfway, and you had to decide whether halfway was enough to keep the door open a crack. Bianca started, at least including Renee in the group chat, as more than a task list. It wasn't everything. It was something. And Charles never did apologize, not really, not in any letter or phone call, though he did send Renee a stiff, formal email 8 months later saying he'd heard about some family stuff and hoped she was doing well, which Renee read once, felt very little about, and did not respond to. Some doors, she'd decided, didn't need reopening just because they'd been unlocked. She had spent 15 years being punished for a resemblance she never asked for. She wasn't required to spend the next 15 making peace with the man who'd caused it. The following spring, on Patricia's 61st birthday, a small dinner, this time just family, at a restaurant Renee actually got to help choose, Patricia stood up before dessert arrived, tapped her water glass with a fork, and said, a little unsteadily, that she wanted to say something. "I got a lot wrong with my kids," she said, looking directly, deliberately at Renee, "and I'm not going to pretend a year of trying makes up for 15 of not. But I want everyone at this table to know that Renee is the reason I'm even capable of standing here and saying that out loud. She didn't do it by yelling at me. She did it by telling the truth in the quietest, bravest way I've ever seen, and I am going to spend whatever years I have left trying to deserve the daughter I already had the whole time." Renee sat very still, her hands around a water glass she wasn't drinking from, and felt something in her chest finally, fully unclench. Not because the 15 years were erased, they weren't, they never would be, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't sitting at the far end of the table near the kitchen door. He was sitting simply at the table. Not because she'd made herself useful enough to earn it. Just because she was Patricia's daughter, and it had taken a quilt and a letter and 15 quiet, patient years of refusing to disappear, for her mother to finally remember that fact without needing a reason attached to it at all.